So here's a thought to consider. If it's not in the language, it's not in your mind. If it's not in your language, it's not in your mind. In her presentation last month, President of Keweenaw Ojibwa Community College, Lawyer Sherman, said that there is no inherent structure or understanding in the Ojibwa language that leads to things like inequality or negative separation or certain distinctions. The Ojibwa language, for example, emphasizes relationships and connections. So she mentioned that the word kwe, which means woman, is linked to the word for earth. Woman and earth. It can mean life giver or life carrier, and it suggests honor. So when a person says the word kwe in Ojibwa, one can think of those things. Exploring language is a creative act of learning words that teach meanings. And for some of us, when we learn a new language, perhaps, it involves learning things in new ways, new understandings. So the Jewish tradition has similar understandings of certain words and concepts, though some of them, I would claim, have been consistently distorted by Christian interpretation and Western worldviews. For example, the word in the Hebrew people's creation story in Genesis for human being is Adam, which means from the ground. Narrowly, we call him Adam. It's a little bit different meaning than being from the ground. It's just a name, a guy. Well, the story in Genesis 2 is that God, or Creator, takes soil from the ground, one big compost pile, some soil from the ground, and breathes into that soil or that clay or that dirt the breath of life. And the word or name that was given to the other human being being Eve, which doesn't mean she or a person, it means life. What do you get then? Life from the ground. It's right there in the story, although that's not the way we hear it or read it. Life or spirit is breathed into humans that are born from the earth. So one of the profound misunderstandings or misinterpretations is that in the story that follows, what it means to have sinned. For our sin, we are punished, and when we die, then we are cursed to return to the earth. For this morning, for this talk, we can simply say this human experience and reality of returning to earth is reflected upon by writers of the writer of the book of Ecclesiastes, which is where we got that first song from, okay? But I would emphasize that what has been in our minds for centuries because of a certain way the words of the story have been understood or misunderstood, that death and returning to earth is a curse. This is something one finds in Christian doctrine, but one does not find it in understandings of indigenous peoples or even within the ancient Jewish readings of this same story. Somewhere it got skewed, I would say. So it was centuries later that another writer's creation story gave comfort to Jewish people who were in exile. The story of the 7 days of creation, which is in Genesis 1, it's actually not as old as the second creation story. The story of the 7 days of creation, an affirmation in the face of tragedy for this Jewish people who were in exile. It was God. The affirmation is it was God who created the cosmos and all within. And as we are suffering tragically now, we need to remind ourselves that God is God. It is also in this first Genesis story that male is differentiated from female. There is no gender differentiation in the older story in Genesis 2 that emphasizes only that God breathes into humans the breath of life, and that we are people of the earth. So then enter the book of Ecclesiastes, in which the author examines and then assesses this human experience between the horizons of birth and death. Perhaps the best known passage is from the 3rd chapter. And Juxta, if you can put this up again, and this is the inspiration for the song, Turn, Turn, Turn. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. It's a beautiful piece of poetry, a description of what it means to be human. For some, it offers comfort, like a good piece of chocolate, but it's bitter and it's sweet at the same time. It offers no, and if you notice, it offers no answer to the question, why? Why are things this way? There's no explanation to the highs and the lows and the extremes that just are as they are. Only that they are appointed by Creator. This writer's wisdom is in recognizing that he or she cannot penetrate beyond that last horizon. The writer can only observe the phenomenon of birth and death and perceive the limits that it places on human beings. Stated simply, the writer of Ecclesiastes examines our limits and our lot in life that includes death. So for all my years as a pastor, I have read this passage at funerals and burials, and it goes along with this passage from the 3rd chapter of Genesis. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. The King James Version is, in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, until thou return unto the ground, for out of it thou wast taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. Well, that is our fundamental human story, seen by many interpreters and preachers as a curse for Adam and Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. But if you look a little more carefully at the story, you might find the answer to the question, what was the sin, that might sound a little different than we are perhaps taught. It's found in the story of temptation in the garden, wanting to be more than human, wanting to have the wisdom of the gods, which is exactly what the critical and oftentimes sarcastic writer of Ecclesiastes is getting at as we labor away, as if by our human efforts we could master the world, lay bare its deepest secrets, and change its fundamental structures, and somehow burst the bonds of human limitations, and build for ourselves enduring monuments, and control our destiny, and achieve a state of secure and lasting happiness and bliss, right? Laboring at life with an overblown conception of human powers, and consequently pursuing unrealistic hopes and aspirations. That's quite a resume for human beings, don't you think? So what is sin? It is turning away from what it means to be human, wanting more than being human, living in a garden of abundance, wanting more than that abundance because that abundance includes both living and dying. So the author of Ecclesiastes concludes that human life in this mode that I just described is folly. It's all futile, the way we live. It is meaningless to live as if it could be any other way. And then as I reflect upon the narrow way that we have understood or misunderstood Genesis and our place in the garden, being of and returning to the earth is not a curse at all. It is simply our reality. To want or seek it as different than what it is sin. Or, as a literal description of the word sin would be, missing the mark as an archer whose aim is bad. Well, many years into my career, another verse from Ecclesiastes suddenly made sense in a new way. And along then with studying creation theology, which is a very different view from traditional sin and redemption theology, a new way of seeing some Ecclesiastes passages began to emerge in my mind, and it helped by reading a great deal of theological and spiritual understandings from around the world. For example, Asian theology or Native American spirituality and theology. And this verse then blew up my mind, and it sounds simple, and it is, but I needed to have the scales that blocked my vision fall away so I could see more clearly. And we cannot find out the larger purposes of God, whatever that might mean to you, or the ultimate meaning of human existence. We can only pose the questions that live within our limits as we sometimes struggle to find meaning. And this is the passage that comes up 3 verses later from that traditional beautiful piece of poetry from Ecclesiastes that I read before and that we sang. God has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, God has put eternity in our minds, yet so that we cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Well, that doesn't help a lot, but it does. With all its enigmas, life in the world is somehow in God's hands or under God somehow. We are given life, and it comes from the earth that also receives us in death. Even though we can't figure out why it is the way that it is, there is a rhythm and a balance to it that, like it or not, includes all those extremes. Where that leaves us is decision makers about how to live with the questions that we have. Blessing or curse is up to us and how we live. It's not, and this is the thing that I would emphasize, and I have for years, it's not some flaw inherent to human beings. We are not fundamentally flawed. We are fundamentally human. And the choices that we make reflect that humanity. Now, I could stop there, but I discovered a few years ago one more passage in that same sequence of verses in Ecclesiastes, because this writer is not quite done yet. So within the limits of human experience and observation, this author is concerned to spell out then for us what is actually good for people to do. And I love what feels like the conclusion of this insightful piece that comes up in verses 12 to 13. I know that there is nothing better for them than to be happy and enjoy themselves as long as they live. Moreover, it is God's gift that all should eat and drink and take pleasure in all their toil. Gavel, conclusion. Things turn, and things change. And in this grand perspective of things, we are one small yet very consequential part of creation. One spoke on that wheel of life. And what we do with that humbling knowledge and insight is up to us. That's all I got today. Thank you.